So good morning, everybody. I am super excited to be here to talk to you all this morning, most especially because it is cold and snowy in New York right now. So winter here in Israel is proving to be a lot nicer. The title of my talk today is The Lies That Hacker News Tells You. And I don't really mean to pick on Hacker News. It's really anywhere that developers congregate. r/programming, Stack Overflow, Twitter. There's a tendency for us to sort of fall in love with the new exciting technologies that are being talked about in these forums. And that's going to be sort of the thrust of the conversation here. But first, let me talk a little bit about myself. At this point, I've worked at a lot of different companies, doing a lot of different things. So early in my career, I started out doing consulting, which was amazing because I got to jump into a lot of different companies and learn different technologies and how different businesses worked. I did a startup where I was engineer number 3, managing all the infrastructure and the APIs. The startup didn't go anywhere, but I learned a ton. And then I found myself eventually sort of accidentally in media, so I worked for Condé Nast as they were transforming all of their brands to digital properties, so Traveler and Vogue and The New Yorker and Vanity Fair and all those folks. And then I found myself at the New York Times, where I got to deal with sort of large-scale engineering problems because we had pretty sizable teams and we were dealing with everything on the digital side of the business as we were transitioning over to having digital subscriptions, but also dealing with the legacy print environment and the mainframes and getting data to the printing facilities and all of those sorts of things. And from a scale perspective, dealing with the burstiness of breaking news, right? So breaking news alerts go out, and then you've got these massive surges coming to your mobile apps and your website and things like that. After the New York Times, then I went on to Tumblr, where I got to deal with the sort of enormous scale problems of a social network, which is really interesting from a data perspective and from a traffic perspective. And as a part of that ride, I got to be part of the acquisition landscape with Yahoo and Verizon. I learned a ton. If you've been paying attention, that didn't go particularly well. But now Tumblr's found itself a new home with the Automatic folks over at WordPress, and hopefully that'll be much better for them. And so what I'm up to now is I'm the CTO at SeatGeek. Thank you. And I joined them earlier this year. As was mentioned, we've got offices all over the world at this point, and I've been finding myself coming to Israel now to hang with the team up in Carmiel. We're going to be moving to the new high-tech park in Bar Lev this summer, so continuing to grow the team here in Israel, and obligatory, yes, we're hiring, and work from home is cool too. What is SeatGeek all about? So we don't have a consumer experience here in Israel, so I'll do a quick run through on what the platform is all about for those that maybe aren't familiar. The mission of the company is to help people experience more live. So think concerts, think sporting events, think theater, anything really involving live entertainment is sort of in our wheelhouse and what we're focused on. And the platform sort of subdivides, you can think about it as two different business lines, right? We sort of think about the consumer marketplace, and so this is where you go to buy tickets, right? And SeatGeek's been a very data-driven company since its early days, and we launched many years ago this thing called Deal Score, where we take a look at the pricing trends around tickets and assess whether the actual ticket that you're looking at is a good deal or not. We get into a lot of personalized recommendations, so we've got a pretty sizable data science team that's working on recommendations and pricing and things like that. We try and do a lot to help you understand what it's going to be like in the venue before you get there, so 2D maps and 3D maps and panoramic views of what the seating is, so that ends up being super fascinating. Paper tickets are basically going away, so now it's also your gateway into the event and how you think about access control once you actually get there. And it is a marketplace, so it's also the space where you would go to resell tickets if you can no longer make it to an event. And so on the other side, we've got the enterprise SaaS platform. And this is what the team in Israel has been focused on for years and years. And at this point, we've got hundreds of customers around the world. And so this SaaS platform is really the back office software that venues are using, right? So if you go to a Maccabi Haifa or Maccabi Tel Aviv game and you're buying tickets, you're going in, that's powered by SeatGeek on the back end. And that's what they're using in the box office and the back office and things like that. I knew nothing about ticketing before joining SeatGeek. I think I had what I would describe as the typical consumer experience of you buy the tickets, you complain about the fees, you scan into the event, and you don't really think about it beyond that. It's a surprisingly Byzantine industry, which means we've got a lot of opportunity to fix it and make it much, much, much better. And it's got really interesting scaling problems. So we haven't had the pleasure of having BTS come through one of our venues yet, but inevitably they will. And when you've got these massive concerts, you're dealing with tickets that you're selling where they're assigned seats, obviously, and you're going based on the best available seating. So literally every single person's query and what they add to their cart is affecting every subsequent query. And when you've got a big name coming into a venue of 100,000 plus seats, you've got to liquidate 400,000 or 500,000 tickets in this manner in a matter of minutes. So that turns out to be a pretty interesting challenge. So let's get back to the purpose of the talk, though. And so as I was thinking about getting back to fundamentals, one of the things that struck me is that, one of the things that I think we deal with primarily as engineers is thinking about what technologies we're going to use. And I think companies sort of struggle to figure out how to make smart decisions about the technologies that they choose, and I think you see that manifest in a lot of different ways. And so I'd like to walk through the decision framework that I've been able to use at a few different companies, and I think hopefully you'll find it helpful. But before we get to that, let's go even farther down the rabbit hole of fundamentals here, and think for a minute about what is your job, right? Like why are you gainfully employed? Why are they paying you a lot of money to be an engineer? What is your job? As you think about it, I'm going to assert it's probably not what you're thinking. I'm going to assert that your job is to make yourself obsolete, and that is what the critical aspect is of thinking about how you make technological choices, is how do you make sure that you are not a single point of failure for your organization. And I really liked Donovan Brown's definition, where DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to end users, right? The technology is fun, but ultimately it's about delivering value. So how do you make sure that as your observability platforms get better, as your CI/CD pipelines get better, as you're eliminating toil, you're moving farther and farther up the stack, and you're making things ultimately better for your users. And so again, when we think about the buzz that you experience on these platforms, yikes, there's sort of broad recognition that the industry moves really fast, right? And we celebrate new technology, but at what cost? I think there's a tendency, us humans, to sort of fear what we're not familiar with, what we don't understand. And that sort of pushes us to what's shiny and new. And you're hopefully familiar with the hype curve. And so whenever there's new technology that comes out, you've got this sort of surge of excitement about what it might be, and then the sort of descent into the trough of disillusionment as you realize that it's probably not all it's cracked up to be, and then eventually sort of the new technology will plateau. And when you're an early adopter, like you're feeling a lot of that pain when you're jumping on the exciting things. And then there's this great law, Hofstadter's law. He's a cognitive scientist, and he says it takes longer than you expect. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. And so you take together the hype curve and you take together our natural tendencies to underestimate how long things are going to take, and you get this exuberance that like, all right, this new technology is going to solve all of my problems. It's rainbows and unicorns, it's going to be amazing, and then you realize that it's not so cool. It's sad. There's that moment when you're searching for a GIF for your slide, and like you can't imagine a more perfect GIF. That was this. So my assertion is that there's a better way, and in order to do it, don't worry about the screen; it'll be fine. I think the first thing you've got to think about is how in your environment you make sure that there's psychological safety. You've got to create an environment where people really genuinely want to hear each other's feedback, and there's an interest on behalf of individuals and teams in seeing their peers succeed, right? If you've got that vested interest in one another's success, I think it makes it much easier to fight against some of these challenges. And so what I've tended to do is establish guiding principles. So I'm going to lay out the guiding principles that I've been using at SeatGeek and companies before that. Your guiding principles may be different, but this is sort of how we approach considering technology. And so the first thing is the deliberate pursuit of simplicity, which allows us to hone our craft over time, to build trust in our tools, and to foster a shared experience among teams, right? So we are knowingly trying to keep our solutions simple, and we're really actively trying to make sure that we develop expertise, shared expertise in our tools, in our platforms, so that we can continue to navigate change, right? Because we have to deliver value for customers. We're not just trying to deliver technology for technology's sake. We also have to recognize the forces around us, right? And so obligatory Conway's law reference, where organizations with design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of those communication structures. So basically, your architecture is going to represent whatever your org chart is, right? Like naturally, your systems and your API endpoints are going to be a reflection of how your teams are structured. In the same paper, this was written in 1968, there's a lot of quotable things from this paper, but I really like this as well. That there's never enough time to do something right, but there's always enough time to do it over. And so, I don't know about you, but I've been involved in lots of projects where we race to the finish line only to realize that it's not going to work for one reason or another, and you've got to double back and redo it once, twice, 3 times, and counting. And so, what does this decision framework look like? The fundamental thing that I do here in terms of drawing distinctions is how you think about what I'm describing as known technologies versus unknown technologies, where a known technology is something that you operate in production today. So your team's got the sort of muscle memory for dealing with this technology, knows its behaviors, knows its patterns, knows what to expect, where unknown technologies are things that you're not running in production yet. So there would be a lot of things to learn for the broader team. And the way that we attack known technologies is with an RFC process. The way we attack unknown technologies is with a process that I describe as departures. And departures are really just a specialized version of an RFC. So RFCs have been around for a long time, and they've been actually gaining quite a bit of prominence internally at companies over the last several years. I've been using them for, coming up on probably 10 years now. I'm curious, just quick show of hands, how many of you have a RFC process in your organization? Wow, not very many. Okay. So let's run through what we do with these requests for comments. So the first thing is why. Why do you bother with this process? And the big assertion that I'm going to make to start is that your system design is always going to be better if you start with pros. And I know we want to race into writing code, But if you can slow down and put pen to paper your thoughts on why it is that you want to approach a given problem with a specific technical solution, you're absolutely going to get a better first version of your design. The other big reason for RFCs is knowledge sharing, right? So you are working through your solution, and maybe people close to you on your team are aware of what you're doing and are learning from what's happening. But the broader engineering team likely is not, unless you are really thoughtful about how you share knowledge. It transcends geography, right? So increasingly, engineering work is very distributed, and we've got engineers all over the place. How do you make sure that everybody can participate in understanding and evolving what your architecture is, and also creating an asynchronous process like this really sort of helps to combat the time zone challenges of coordinating across geos. And anyone can participate. So at SeatGeek, we broadcast these in a really wide way, and so it's very common on RFCs to see commentary coming in from folks on the sales team and the marketing team in a way that would never happen without a process like this until something got to production and they said, oh, actually, that's probably not going to work for one reason or another. And so how do we go about it? Very, very basic stuff here. We use Google Docs and have a standard template that everybody uses. The high-level gist of what that template looks like is to offer up some prior reading, like what are the things that you should look at in terms of internal and external documentation to be ramped up on what we're trying to accomplish. What are the high-level goals of the project, right? I think, again, critically, why are we trying to solve this problem before you get into what the technology is? And then possible solutions, where we use this structure where you will list out the things that you considered and be very explicit about the ones that were rejected before getting to the approach that you chose as your accepted solution, and then you dive into what that entails in your implementation overview. And then you need a broadcast mechanism. And so again, we keep it very simple. It's just a Google form. You go to, you submit this Google form, and then your RFC gets blasted out to a Slack channel and an email group. The form responses are in a spreadsheet that is open to everybody, so you've got a long-running database of what all the RFCs have been, and you can check on their statuses. And then the question that I often get is, well, when should I be sending these RFCs? How should I think about that? And this is sort of what I've anchored on over time, which is if another team was working on a similar thing, would you be interested in learning about that design? Would you be interested in being able to participate in the conversation? So it's really like what's going on that you think is of interest. And then critically, you want to send them out before you're in love with your new design, right? I think we've all been in that place where you've got your design and now you're in love with it, and nobody's going to tell you that that's not the right way to do it. So you certainly will have to do some exploration, probably some proof of concepting, but you want to get the RFCs out before you get to a place where you're really unable to absorb the feedback. And then the next question I get about RFCs is, well, who gets to decide, right? What I'm describing sounds like it's going to be some big, messy, like committee-based process, right? The way that I orient this is that the tie goes to the runner, so the agency lies with the team that's driving forward the technological change with this RFC. And I've been doing this for years and years and years, and I think when you create the right environment where people, again, are vested in each other's success, the number of times where I've had to get in and referee on an RFC, I could count on one hand. I mean, it just doesn't happen when you create the right environment. But technologies that are unknown, again, I think we need a slightly different approach. And that's what these departures look like. And I want to give a quick hat tip to Kellen, who's formerly CTO over at Etsy. These days he's hanging out at Dropbox. And I was talking about the ways that I'd been wrestling with managing technological change, and he and I were spitballing on how he'd been dealing with things and how I'd been dealing with things, and that sort of led me to this process. So a lot of credit to Kellen and sharing beers and horror stories about managing technological change. And so technology moves fast, and the established patterns eventually break down, right? Like your architecture matures, you get more scale, you move into adjacent markets, and eventually the things that you're doing become insufficient. So you've got to drive change. But what I want people to do when they're thinking about driving change is be a little bit skeptical, right? Don't just rush into the new thing without really thinking through what's at hand here. And I'm making a few assertions. And the first is that, look, no technology is perfect. We hear it all the time. There's no silver bullets. This is a very real factor. And living on the bleeding edge is painful. If you are the biggest user of a piece of software, there isn't going to be much you can do when you start running into problems in production. There isn't really going to be anybody you can turn to help. And then switching to new technologies always adds to technical debt first, right? So I think fairly logically, if you've got an old system and you're introducing a new way of doing it, now you're running two systems, hopefully the new system will replace the old system, but we've also, I'm sure, all seen instances of the new system not working out, and now the new system represents technical debt. So no matter how you go, you're going to have some struggles of navigating technical debt. And again, prediction is really hard. It's just something we humans are not very good at. And lastly, the old adage of like, oh, you know, I built it at the last hackathon, we should just put it in production, or I spent the weekend working on this project, it's ready to go, is never a good reason to deploy technology. And then the transfer of knowledge, you know, the whole thrust of what I'm talking about here is about how we share information with one another and how we try to have this shared understanding of what your architecture looks like. But the reality is there's always going to be nuances, there's always going to be subtleties, there's just never going to be this true shared understanding. And then there's really a sort of spectrum in terms of how you should be approaching this. So an internal tool that's got a handful of users should have a very different calculus than a tier 1 service running in production that's dealing with enormous amounts of traffic that, you know, wanting to change out a component there should have a much higher degree of scrutiny than again, the other end of the spectrum with internal tooling. And so in being skeptical, the posture that I sort of ask folks to take is, I have this crazy idea, please talk me out of it, right? And be open to having the conversations and being challenged and figure out if you're on the right path. And so again, we're going to put pen to paper. I think that's how you're going to express your ideas best. And I want to stress here that I've been talking about some processes that we use as an organization, but as we saw, you know, a lot of folks aren't in places that have RFC processes or things like that. So as I dig into these departure questions, what I want to stress to you all is that, like, if you follow this approach, I think you'll make better decisions as an individual, and I think you'll be able to use this information to make more convincing arguments when you're ready to drive things forward. So I'm going to lay out 10 questions. And I think, again, if you get these 10 questions right, you're going to be in business to do what you want to do. First one, obvious, very basic. What problem are you trying to solve? This really, though, susses out whether you're chasing technology for technology's sake or if you've got a legitimate problem that requires something new. The second question is, how can we solve it with the current stack? I think there's, again, this tendency to jump into something new, but how could we actually do it with the existing technologies deployed in our organization? Even if it ends up looking like a Rube Goldberg machine. Like, if you haven't thought deeply enough about your problem to be able to answer this question, I think you're probably on the wrong track jumping to something new. But once you've thought about it, then that should give you the ammunition to really describe what's difficult about your current stack with respect to the solution that you're trying to drive. So I had a very real example of this just a couple weeks ago. At SeatGeek, we're big RabbitMQ users, and an engineer is dealing with one of these processes that, as we've scaled, is sort of not really working anymore. And he put together sort of a detailed plan of how he could refactor it to continue to work with Rabbit. And it was painfully obvious as he detailed the way to do it that it just wasn't going to work, and it was time to move on. And the next one is the risks, right? Which is quite a bit different than what's difficult. And I pull these questions out separately to get people to think about articulating them differently. Because there's certainly risks with sticking with old technology. And so what are those? How do we quantify them? How do we think about what makes sense going forward? And then speaking of quantification, you've got costs, right? So when we're jumping to the new technology, let's be clear-eyed about what is it going to mean in terms of costs for people, time, new licenses, hardware. There's all kinds of things that could impact what the costs are going to look like. And then critically, how are other people solving the problem that you've got? I think what I love about being an engineer and working in this industry is how open we all are about talking about our technical solutions. There's a lot of proprietary concerns on the business side of organizations, but on the engineering side, we can trade stories about how we're solving problems and really dig deep on what those solutions look like. So take advantage, like reach out to people and figure out when they went with the technology that you were looking at, what did they like about it? What did they hate about it? What were they surprised by? And I think armed with that information, you're going to end up with a much better implementation for yourself. And then are we committed to moving everything to this new technology? So you've got to have a plan, in my opinion, when you're moving to something new to make sure that the new software can completely eat whatever the existing solution is, right? You've got to get to 100% to getting rid of what the old thing was. What does that plan actually look like? Which leads to the classic XKCD of, whenever there's a challenge of too many systems doing the same thing, you introduce a new system, it's going to replace everything, and of course it does not. But this is why you need a plan, right? And this stuff is hard, because getting to that 80% mark is sort of the easy bits. Getting to 100%, getting all the way is much tougher. What's a low-risk way to get started is the next important question. So again, is there some internal tool where you could deploy it first? If it's a new data pipeline, can you introduce it in a dark mode running with the old pipeline and the new pipeline at the same time? Same thing with data stores. There's always ways to trial the technology before you're all the way committed and figure out, all right, if it's not working, how do we bail? What does it look like? Who else is supportive of this new approach, right? I think there's usually the sort of one or two evangelists that are super excited about a new technology, but have you been able to persuade other people at the organization that this is a good way to go? I think that's a critical part of success is again, getting everybody to be sort of bought into the direction that you're taking. And then how will we teach people this new technology? So back at Tumblr, early days of Kotlin support on Android, we had Android engineers spread across a whole bunch of different teams, and sort of the typical scenario for new technology, there was one engineer that was super passionate about Kotlin, was ready to rewrite the whole app and just rush right into it. And this is the question that made him sort of stop and think, well, all right, we got engineers all over the place. How actually are we going to do this? And he created study groups and found a way to get everybody excited and engaged in a way that allowed us to commit to Kotlin, even though it was pretty early days. And so running through sort of a quick recap here, it's important to have an environment that's going to nurture the way that you think about technological change, right? So this is a big thing for managers to be thinking about, lay out those principles so that everybody can be really deliberate about the decisions that you're making. I'm a big fan of RFCs. I definitely would recommend you look into seeing if you can get those going. I think you can do them even within a team context. You don't need them to be some company-wide thing at the outset. I would strongly consider using this departure framework, even if it's just for your own writing, your own thinking, to make sure that you're on the right track. Just a quick recap of all the questions that I think you should be using. And again, as a reminder, I think your job is to make yourself obsolete. I think if you do that, that's when you become truly indispensable, right? When you're able to make sure that you're able to move up to higher order problems, things that are going to deliver more leverage. You are going to be ultimately much, much, much more valuable, which is going to be good for your pocketbook. I hope you enjoyed, and please enjoy Hacker News responsibly. Thanks, guys.